If you watched my previous video, you'll know that I had to resort to desperate measures in order to keep my keyboard alive, plundering all of my remotes in search of power, ultimately leaving me without any control over my home entertainment domain. Hopeless and desperate, the situation left me with only one choice: spend €423 on a rechargeable alternative. Jokes aside, this remote has been a long time coming. I used to live in harmony with my devices back in the day when Logitech still handed out magic. Nowadays, the landscape is looking quite a bit different. Options are scarce and good-looking ones even more so. Enter the Unfolded Circle Remote 3, promising to do all of that and look good while doing so. And after having used it for the past 2 months, I have to admit, I kind of forgot that I had it. In an attempt to make this feature a bit more watchable, I'm going to try to split everything up into chapters. First, I'll do a hardware overview, like usual. But then, instead of going through the software, I want to show you how I have mine set up, using 3 of my primary use cases, each highlighting the highs and lows of the Remote 3. I'll start with my most used one, the AppleTV, which is the primary driver for all of my audiovisual shenanigans. I'll also include a small trick I discovered in order to keep the remote connected to the Apple TV, even in prolonged viewing sessions. Then it's prime time, controlling my physical AV receiver and Blu-ray player using the IR integration, and the setup of it, which caused more than one head-scratching moment. Lastly, my living room gaming PC. Those of you who've been following along my journey of couch potato domination will know that I already succeeded in being able to turn it on remotely. But having the option to trigger it with the device that I'm already holding isn't something I want to pass on. So, if one of these tickled your fancy, or if you are curious to see how many movie references I can jam into a single video review of a remote, you're in the right place. Now, shall we begin? The hardware is beautiful. There's almost nothing bad I can say about it, and even what I'm going to eventually nitpick about isn't really that big of a deal. For a Kickstarter project, it is one, if not the closest it ever gotten to what I hoped, dreamed it would work and feel like. There was an immediate satisfaction when I picked it out from its slumbering box for the first time. The heft of it alone, about 156 grams, immediately told me, this is for real, this one's here to stay. The first thing everyone is probably drawn to is the big LCD screen at the top, unfortunately not OLED, which would have been a killer, especially during those dark horror screenings where every little bleeding distraction matters. Although there is a mode just for those moments. I'll talk more about that rectangular glow box in the other chapters. For now, let's move around the hardware some more. There are no buttons on the sides or on top, but there is a cutout for the IR blaster and receiver, which works in conjunction with the dock, which I'll get to in a second as well. The back is slightly arched, letting the remote gently rock to sleep when placed down. It also reveals the wireless charging capabilities on an absurdly fingerprint-prone back. 5 watts of cheese, what it will receive on a compatible pad. Which doesn't sound like much compared to our phone brethren, but then again, this is a remote with a built-in 2400 mAh battery, not a smartphone. Although I kinda got the impression that I'm dealing with one nonetheless, or something aching to be one, just in different clothing. Alternatively, you can also use the mentioned dock to charge it, which it does so by way of the 3 stooges at the bottom, with a fit that I'd say is decent, reason being that it only worked about 9 out of 10 times. Every now and then I would just miss the approach angle slightly, resulting in a dead remote the next day. There is an audible beep emitted when it docks securely though, but it can be easily missed if not being paid attention to, even at max volume. Of course, you can also charge it wirelessly as mentioned, but you kind of lose the almost pretentious display of presence the dock supplies. Going back to the remote and flipping it topside again, we finally reach the physical buttons, and here's where I have a tiny nitpick. In general, they feel great to press down. It also took me very little time to get used to the layout, and blind navigation, an essential requirement in my home, was quickly achieved. However, there's a small gap of air between the rubberized surface and the actual clicky part underneath it. This doesn't inherently cause any issues, but it does make the remote feel a bit cheaper than it should be, considering the rest of the build and of course the price. It's most noticeable on the Enter or Center button, which ironically is also the one I press the most often. Likewise, there are small, tiny gaps at the bottom of the housing where there's just a little light bleed coming through. It's again nothing to write home about. It doesn't impact functionality at all, but it does nag right at the back of my head. Otherwise, this is, as already mentioned and hopefully visually conveyed, an absolutely beautiful device. I have the silver edition, there is also a darker alternative and of course the matching dock. But let's move on to the next chapter, because it's time to set it up and look at that big beautiful screen. Getting it to work with the Apple TV was both easier and much more confusing than I thought. But it also opened up the pathways to possibilities I didn't even know existed, especially with an Apple device. Before we get into depth though, I'll try to explain how the remote works, or at least how I understand it. You essentially have 4, technically 5 layers of configuration hierarchy. At the very top, it begins with profiles, which is, in simple terms, pretty much what you'd expect, user profiles. So you can set up the remote to your heart's content and let other inhabitants of your household do the same. Profiles themselves don't do much on their own though, it's what's inside that matters. Which is something called activities, which are aptly named if you ask me, because that's how you should think of them. An activity you'd like to do, like watching Apple TV for example. You can also think of an activity as a grouping of devices that then work together to fulfill your entertainment needs, like a TV, AV receiver, and a Blu-ray player in conjunction. However, before anything like that can actually be controlled, you'll need to connect or integrate them, which is where devices, integrations, and entities come in. Confused yet? I know, it'll sadly get a little worse before it gets better. But let's try to explain it with the Apple TV example. In order to set it up, you'll have to go to the web interface first, which is the primary hub to configure everything on the Remote 3. There are a limited number of integrations you can do straight on the remote, but for the Apple TV, you're going to need a bigger boat. Accessing it is super easy though. Once you connect it to the Wi-Fi, you can simply log in using the provided PIN code. On the resulting dashboard, you'll then be greeted with the options to add a new device and/or an activity. But remember, devices and integrations first, then activities. So let's just do that and pick the Apple TV, follow the instructions and confirm where asked and needed. This process was super straightforward, however, this doesn't really set up anything, it just establishes the connection between the remote and the Apple TV. But now that we have that, we can finally create the activity. Apart from the name, we're here to chew bubblegum and set an icon, and I was all out of bubblegum, so I resorted to an unimaginative fruit. Unbelievably confusing sentences aside, you can pick a name and an icon to label your activity. There's also a setting to prevent the remote from sleeping and thus losing connection. However, this never worked for me, at least not with the Apple TV, but I do have a workaround I'll show later. Then you can select the devices or integrations from the list. For the Apple TV, this was pretty easy as it was just Apple TV. After you hit next, you're in the main menu of the activity. Here you can change, add or remove entities, which are kind of the individual functions of your integrated or connected devices. This was super confusing to me at first because the Apple TV just has one entity, Apple TV. But I'll talk more about this later. For now, let's continue with the setup. Next up are these sequences. I will cover this in the next chapter too, so let's do another jump straight to the arguably most interesting and fun part, the touchscreen customization. As you can see, I've set mine up with a playback indicator at the top and a grid of my 8 most used functions and apps. Before owning this remote, I actually never knew it was possible to directly launch apps on the Apple TV, but you can, which makes navigation so much faster. Whatever is installed is selectable, but it took me a while to figure out how to do this. First, you have to add a new widget, which is what the individual elements are called on the remote's grid. For each, you can decide whether or not you want to display an icon or small text. I went for the former, as I thought it simply looked better. After having added the input source widget, you'll be able to select which app on the Apple TV it should open. You can then define an icon. Here we could go the regular route and pick one out of the stockpile. I, however, had the urge for custom ones, and luckily setting this up was pretty easy too. All you really need is a 90 by 90 pixel image. I found a great selection over on icons8.com. Of course, if you have more obscure ones like a local broadcaster, you might have to create it yourself. You can then do this for each widget and also move and resize them around until you have the setup you envisioned. You can also create multiple pages, so if you have a lot of devices with a lot of functions or just want to have every app or TV channel right at your fingertips, this is going to be your playground. But with my simpleton setup of 8 widgets, I was more than happy. It also let me place the resizable playback indicator at the top nice and large. Which, by the way, is super fantastic. It will not only display the artwork, but also the title and current runtime of whatever you're watching. I like this a lot. Gone are the days of hitting a remote button just to see where you're at in your show or movie and disturbing the view. A quick wiggle at the gyro-equipped remote and you'll know. Let's wrap this up with some button customizations, because yes, all of those physical buttons are just as customizable, and I've simply set them to the Apple TV equivalent. Since my Fruit box controls the power, volume, and source of my TV and AV receiver over HDMI-CC, this was the only configuration left to do. The only thing that can't be set up yet is the microphone, which is a pity as typing anything on an Apple TV is a bit of a pain in the behind. Speaking of behinds, it was finally time to get physical. During the week, I most often remain on the Apple TV and thus never leave this activity, which works great by the way, because the remote remembers the state even after being docked. There's however only one issue with this setup, and it's when the remote falls asleep. In order to preserve battery life, the screen will shut down after a few seconds, and that's okay, but there is an additional sleep mode that kicks in minutes later, where the remote will unfortunately completely disconnect from the Apple TV. When it does so, it always takes a few seconds, noticeable seconds, to reconnect to the Apple TV, meaning it becomes difficult, no impossible, to stop your binge if you go beyond that sleep timer. There's no default way to prevent this. Like I mentioned before, the prevent sleep setting in the activity never worked for me. However, I do have a cheeky workaround I discovered when I noticed that the sleep timer setting on the remote had a limit of 5 minutes and on the web interface 30 minutes. Neither of which is enough, to be honest. 30 might just work for shorter TV shows, but anything more prime time won't do. So what's the solution then? Well, if you go back to the web interface, navigate to the power saving settings and right-click on the sleep timeout slider and select Inspect Element, you can actually change the limit in the HTML code, which is 1800 seconds per default, or 30 minutes as stated on the interface. I replaced it with 7200 seconds, which is 2 hours and should be enough for most movies and definitely all TV shows. You don't even need to hit save or anything else, just adjusting the HTML here and then dragging the slider to the new limit will do the trick. Now, I've had this setting for the past 2 months and it has worked absolutely flawlessly. Even after restarting the remote, it retained the set timeout, which even displays correctly on the web interface. Just don't touch the adjustment bar after having reloaded or revisited the settings page, as the HTML will be reset. However, I can't guarantee that this will work after the next update, and I really hope Unfolded doesn't patch this, because at first I almost deemed the remote unusable. It was infuriating to have to wait to be able to control your devices after 30 minutes, thus, in my opinion, absolutely failing the most basic function of a remote control. Of course, this isn't perfect, you will feel a pretty big hit in battery life when doing this. However, unless you binge watch all day, you're not going to run into this limit, or at least I didn't. For this review, I took one for the team and spent a day watching TV, reaching the battery limit after about 4 to 6 hours. During this time, I've used the remote to skip intros and outros of a TV show about every 20 to 25 minutes. If you have a wireless charger or the dock close by, this might not even be an issue at all. Alright, this sums up the basic configuration, as well as the Apple TV integration. For the record, I also connected my Philips Hue system to this activity to control my lights for an optimal TV and movie watching experience using the macro functionality. This allows you to set up a reusable group of entities and specific settings to do your bidding. In the end, this entirely fulfilled my desires for controlling my basic home entertainment needs. However, this just replaced one remote with another. It was time to set up the undead, physical media. I won't dwell too long on the setup of this, as we've just covered a lot of that. But it all begins once again with activities, integrations, and entities, which for the Apple TV and the briefly mentioned Philips Hue lights happened via a network connection. However, if your device doesn't support this, or if there is simply no integration available yet, you'll have to resort to good old infrared, or IR. Not to be confused with ER, which is where I ended up after the pairing process with the dock, which you need in order to use the IR functionality, especially the learning ability. Getting it to work, however, was, as just mentioned, for the lack of a better phrase, a real pain. Unlike the remote, which connected to my Wi-Fi without a hitch, it just didn't. It took me hours of fiddling around, ultimately resorting to an entire network reset, which I'm actually not sure was what solved it in the end. But the dock isn't entirely to blame, I am part of the equation too. You see, during the Wi-Fi setup, I was repeatedly asked to confirm the pairing via the physical button on top, which I decided must be the dimple at the front, which it wasn't. The true king was the indent on the back, so maybe the problem was actually me. I am the brick now.
Double kill!
You can of course also set it up via Ethernet, even using PoE or Power over Ethernet, which is really cool. However, I don't have a cable to where the dock is going, so you're my only hope, OB Wi-Fi. Okay, that might be a bit of a stretch there. I'm going to tone it down from here on out, I'll promise. Let's get back to the IR functionality. As mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, you'll need this if your devices cannot be integrated via the network or other, more modern ways of communication. What we essentially need to do is teach the Remote 3 the IR commands from the devices, nay, their remotes, so we can integrate and replace them. Let me try to explain this a little more elaborately. When you hit a button on an IR remote, the infrared command is then shot across the room to receiving end. This command is then interpreted and translated into whatever it is registered as, for example, volume up. What we can now do with the Remote 3 and the help of its dock is teach it those commands by firing them at it. In order to do this, we actually don't start with an integration this time, but rather an entity. In here, there's a neat little section for infrared where we can add a new device. There are two ways to go about this. First, if you're lucky, the Remote 3 will be familiar with what you're trying to add and have the respective IR commands already stored. If you're super lucky, it'll even have a name that makes sense. You can then test this before you continue, so you don't end up with hours of customization work for nothing. But I chose to take the second approach, teaching. For this, you can start with a blank IR device. Doing this, we have to add each command manually, first by giving it a name and then hit Learn IR Code, pick the dock as the student and hit Learn Code again. The dock will then light up green, signalizing that it is ready to receive, meaning you can take your old remote, point it at the dock and fire at will. The dock will then capture that signal and display it in the web interface. Pretty cool, right? You can then finish up by clicking Save. You will have to repeat this for every command you wish to use though, until the spirit of the old remote lives in the new remote. The process afterwards is exactly the same as for the Apple TV. You can assign the IR command as a widget to either the touchscreen or directly to one of the hardware buttons within your activity. You can also combine multiple IR devices together or mix and match with whatever you have or need within the activity. The customization options are really quite vast here, meaning we can create sort of a super remote that will control the TV, AV receiver and the Blu-ray player all via IR. You can, and I also did, set up a launch sequence, so my TV, AV receiver and Blu-ray player are all powered on one battle after another, before switching the input source to Blu-ray. This technically concludes the setup, but I want to highlight a few more things before wrapping up. The first doesn't concern the Remote 3 itself, but is a neat little thing to know. For this, I urge home theater enthusiasts and certain vocal viewers of my home theater speaker setup video to avert their eyes and hit mute. Yes, I still haven't moved my center speaker, and my Blu-ray player also sits in the middle of my cabinet in an almost airtight confinement. I believe at this point what little credibility I had left is now gone, likely along with the second to last viewer of this video. So since it's just the two of us now, may I address you by your first name? Thank you. Pleasure to meet you, Bill. Since the Blu-ray player is hidden from sight, it can't actually receive any IR commands. So in order to still control it, I'm using something called an IR repeater, which is this very handy and very cheap cable that contains an IR receiver and blaster on either end. What it does is capture any IR command it sees and just passes it along its cable to the other side. I have one side sticking out from a visible area on my cabinet and the other side inside the closed compartment where the Blu-ray player is, thus passing along the signal. Pretty cool, right, Bill? Yeah, this works really well and made the setup a lot more provable by the local home decor authorities. The next point is about the necessity of IR in the first place. If my Blu-ray player had an actual integration, I wouldn't have to do any of this. I would also have a much better experience. Let's take the Apple TV as an example again. The neat playback indicator at the top of the touchscreen isn't available here because the remote doesn't actually know what's going on. It only knows the IR commands we taught it and never more. This will likely be the case for a lot of older devices too. There are sometimes community integrations though, like for my Onkyo AV receiver. However, those might come with their own set of restrictions. In my case, it was the requirement for a wired Ethernet connection, which I don't have, so I couldn't use it. However, even if IR is your only choice, you might not have to set up everything manually. Yes, there are pre-stored IR commands on the Remote 3, but there are also community packages expanding this, which is once again really nice. I feel though it almost made the process a little easier doing it all by myself. By doing it manually, I was able to only transfer what I needed, and I gave it names that I could actually understand, making the customization later just a little easier. Alright, time to get to the final use case, the gaming PC. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I must apologize for the change in my tonal performance. You see, I have fallen ill, headache, fever, and the chill, so I came here to explain myself and do a plug, because I'm the YouTuber who likes to. Getting the PC to boot via the remote was by far the easiest activity to set up, especially with the knowledge of the previous two. Just for context, I have a dedicated gaming PC sitting in my living room quarters, which has entirely replaced my Series X and PS5 at this point. I've made 3 dedicated videos on this subject, they're all linked down below if you're interested. One of my goals was to be able to boot it from the comfort of my couch, preferably using a controller, just like a console. In the end, I settled on not turning the PC off completely, but rather have it wake from sleep triggered by the controller. However, the Remote 3 releases the Kraken and enables an additional way of turning the PC on. You might have already guessed it. Yes, there is a community integration to trigger the PC via Wake on LAN. If this again sounds like Klingo Lingo, let me do the old Expelliarmus. That doesn't quite work, I think. I mean, I'll try to explain. Wake on LAN basically means that you can wake your PC by sending it a network signal to kick it into gear, top gear. Most often you will find the setting for this in the BIOS of your motherboard. Some even have wake via Wi-Fi. However, additional options may be required and are dependent on your make and model. After you enable this feature, you can go back to the web interface of the Remote 3. Since this is a custom integration, I had to download it first, but installing it was super easy. Just upload it onto the web interface and continue like usual. Within the integration, you can then add the Wake on LAN entity and continue with creating the activity for it. Unlike for the previous two, I only set up a start sequence as all I wanted was for the PC to boot. The gaming controller will take over after. For some reason, the entity of choice is again called input source, which I ignored at this point and simply entered the MAC address after having added it. And that's it. This worked right out of the gate, and I was and am really pleased with how simple this was. Kinda questioning my previous efforts with the controller, to be honest. However, there's a bit I left out until now. It actually doesn't work for me, because I don't have a wired Ethernet connection and my motherboard doesn't have Wake via Wi-Fi. But while creating this video, I got so annoyed at my lack of Ethernet in the living room that I am currently working on a solution for that, so please just ignore this fact for now. Anyhow, you can of course add more functionality to the Steam activity, like volume control, input source switching, and so on, using whatever integration you have or need. It's not limited to those either. For example, the remote itself can be paired via Bluetooth to the PC as well. This way I can use it to navigate Steam in big picture mode. It's not something I do, but it is possible. Not to go too deep into this topic, but theoretically the Remote 3 could also replace my rather complicated HDMI CEC setup, which switches the HDMI inputs automatically when my PC wakes up. I could simply do what I did for the BluRay activity, create a power on sequence and input source switching to get all the devices ready to play. But that's a minor detail if you ask me. I think I've covered enough. This ends now. Let's conclude with some final thoughts on the Unfolded Circle Remote 3 and how it's been faring for me for the past 2 months. In general, I love this thing, and it has generally replaced all of my other remotes. I barely even notice that it's there anymore, meaning that it has integrated itself so well that I stopped thinking about it. There were occasional issues though. The worst one yet was a total loss of connection. None of the network functionalities worked anymore, and it basically rendered the Remote 3 useless for my main activity. This was actually quite annoying as I had to dig out my legacy controllers in order to regain command. In the end, restarting the router fixed the issues, but it has resorted to me keeping the elderly close, just in case. Having a device to do everything is pretty neat, but it also creates a giant single point of failure, which makes me a bit anxious about the future of the Remote 3. Right now the integrations work fine, but even on Unfolded's own website they state that updates for third-party devices can break them. Granted, that's a risk you always have with devices like these, but it's still something to keep in mind. One thing to mention though is that the Remote 3 runs everything locally and does not require any cloud or subscription services. This is a huge plus in my books, and looking at today's annoying landscape of how software is being sold, it's a rather uncommon practice, but one that I very much applaud. Although there is no reliance on other services, the remote does rely on its user, and this is where I have my second gripe. I don't know about you, but when I set something up, I can get quite creative with my configurations, for better or worse. And 6 months down the road, I'm certain that I will have completely forgotten anything and everything that I did. Meaning, if an issue arises, which always will, I have to first figure out what the heck I did. Which means I have to rely on the UX to get back into the blazing saddle as fast as possible, which here will be a challenge. Wrapping my head around the hierarchy of settings took me some time, and I still feel as if I don't fully understand it. In order to illustrate my point, I would like to go on a rant about the various ways of how you can delete something on the web interface of the Unfolded Circle Remote 3. Let's start with the entities. If I wanted to delete one, I need to first select the entity upon which the delete icon will reveal itself. Okay, I can live with that. Hiding basic icons is never a good idea, but I'll go along. Let's move over to integrations. Here the delete icon will reveal itself when you hover over one. Okay, it's slightly different in an interface that looks almost the same, but at least it's the same for activities. Cool. But what if I go inside an activity? Oh, here the icon is visible all the time, but not clickable. It becomes active once I've selected it. So it's kind of an advanced version of the one found on the entities page. That's alright, I guess. Let's move on to the sequences page. Oh, here we have a combination. It's on the element, but also available as a select option. Fascinating. But that's surely it. There can't possibly be more, right? Ah, you're too good-hearted, Bill. Behold, the pager function on the user interface customization page. If you remember, you can add multiple pages of widgets to your remote, but how do you delete a page if you don't need it anymore? There's no delete button visible anywhere. Not on hover, not on click, nothing. Where is it, you might ask? Well, let's click on the edit icon. It will surely open up a new page or a modal window like everywhere else, which will then contain the delete button, right? Surprise! It's a drop-down menu with delete at the very bottom. Look, this might sound benign, but things like this can really throw me off, especially if I don't frequently use it. There are a lot more cases like this within the UI that are more confusing than helpful, which don't worry, I won't get into as it would take forever. But I hope I got my point across. However, I do applaud them for including Schweizerdeutsch as a language option. I believe the team behind this is partially based in Switzerland, and as a fellow Swiss, I bow my head to all their efforts and say merci. Despite all of my nitpicks though, I do think the Remote 3 was well worth it for me. Having just one device, one this nice to hold, has definitely elevated my living room experience. Even with my limited usage, and believe me, how I use it barely touches the tip of the iceberg. I completely ignored the touch bar here, for example, but mostly because it doesn't do anything for any of my devices. Anyway, if you're still watching at this point, let me express my eternal gratitude with the final movie reference for the day. Dear viewer, I must accept the fact that you probably sacrificed what felt like a whole Saturday to watch this, and for that, I am truly grateful. You are definitely crazy for doing this, but I see it as more than just that. You see this channel, this video, and even me as you want to see it, in the simplest terms, in the most convenient definitions. But what I found out is that each one of you is more than just a subscriber, a commenter, or a casual watcher. You are a brain and an athlete, a basket case, a princess, and a criminal. For this, I am eternally grateful. Sincerely yours, The Cheese Club. Thank you for watching, and see you again in the new year. Bye. Not again.